Poštovani gledalci, dobrodošli u još jedno izdanje emisije Granice Istoka. Ja sam Harun Karčić. Vodeće svjetske pomorske transportne kompanije promijenile su rutu svojih brodova nakon sve učestalijih napada Husa u Crvenom moru, što je izazvalo zabrinutost da će i druge kompanije obustaviti prolaz kroz Moreus Bab el-Mandeb. Husi su zaprijetili da će u znak solidarnosti sa Palestinom gađati brodove pod izraelskom zastavom ili one koji idu u izraelske luke. MSC, najveća svjetska kontejnerska kompanija, danska kompanija Maersk, njemačka Hapag-Lloyd i francuska CMA-CGM objavili su da su obustavili sva putovanja Crvenim morem nakon pogoršanja sigurnosne situacije. Crveno more, koje povezuje Sredozemno more sa Indijskim okeanom, pruža vitalni pomorski put za globalnu trgovinu. Kroz Suezki kanal na sjeveru i Moreus Bab el-Mandeb na jugu, ova vodena ruta omogućuje brz i ekonomičan prijevoz tereta između Europe, Bliskog Istoka i Azije. S obzirom na stratešku važnost ovog pomorskog pravca, političke napetosti i sukobi u regiji mogu ozbiljno utjecati na svjetsku trgovinu. Detaljnije pojašnjava kolegica Hanan Nanić.
Crveno more među najvažnijim je trgovinskim rutama između Azije i Europe, posebice kad je riječ o nafti i plinu. Prostire se od zaljeva Bab el-Mandeb na jugu do Suezkog kanala na sjeveru i te tri točke su među najvažnijim geostrateškim lokacijama na planetu. Zaljev Bab el-Mandeb južni je prirodni ulaz u Crveno more između Arapskog poluotoka i Afričkog kontinenta, odnosno Jemena i Džibutija. Širok je otprilike 25 km i ima strateški značaj kao prolaz između Crvenog mora i Adenskog zaljeva. Napadi Husa uglavnom su fokusirani u uskom zaljevu Bab el-Mandeb, preko kojeg dnevno oko 50 brodova plovi prema Suezkom kanalu, glavnoj arteriji globalne trgovine. Suezki kanal umjetan je vodeni put izgrađen 1869. koji povezuje Crveno more sa Sredozemnim. Važan je za međunarodnu trgovinu jer omogućava najkraći put između Europe i Azije, odnosno izbjegava putovanje oko Afričkog kontinenta. Suezki kanal je ključni trgovinski i ekonomski koridor kojim prolazi veliki broj teretnih brodova svake godine, odnosno 15% ukupnog svjetskog pomorskog prometa. Izlaz na Crveno more imaju Jemen, Saudijska Arabija, Jordan i Izrael s jedne i Džibuti, Eritreja, Sudan i Egipat s druge strane. Prije aktualne krize ovom rutom je prolazilo 12% svjetske trgovine i 10% svjetske nafte. Vrijednost dobara koja su prolazila ovom rutom procjenjuje se na više od 1000 milijardi dolara godišnje. Zbog napada pripadnika pokreta Husi na brodove u Crvenom moru, mnoge svjetske kompanije odlučile su se na sigurniju rutu, onu oko Afričkog kontinenta i rta Dobre nade, koja je duža i do 10 dana, odnosno 6000 km. Sva ta roba u konačnici će, osim što će kasniti, biti i skuplja. Meta su zapadne kompanije ili one s krajnjim odredištem u Izraelu. Husi pokušavaju prisiliti Izrael da zaustavi rat i omogući humanitarnu pomoć u Gazu. Husi kineskim i ruskim brodovima jamče prolazak bez smetnji i napada. Od početka napada na brodove u Crvenom moru je promet pao za više od 40%, što ometa globalne lance opskrbe. Na putu prema Europi je i manje blisko istočne nafte nego ranije. Podaci pokazuju da se obim smanjio gotovo duplo. Od više od 1 milion barela koji su dnevno išli prema Europi u 10. na oko 570.000 barela dnevno u 12. mjesecu.
Idemo slikom do Washingtona gdje se nalazi James Himberger, glavni i odgovorni urednik magazina The National Interest. James, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera channel. Thank you so much for taking time to speak to us. Now, you've been following events in the Middle East for quite some time now. The threat against merchant ships in the Bab el-Mandeb and the Red Sea area has significantly increased since the start of the war between Israel and the Hamas group in Gaza in October 2023. The Yemeni-based Houthi militia has declared solidarity with the Palestinians and as a result has attacked or threatened to hijack ships which are associated with Israel or which are destined for Israeli ports. What impact is this having on global trade and on maritime security?
Yeah, I'd say the longer that this situation persists, the higher the impact it'll have on the global economy. The Red Sea is a critical sea lane for commerce, not just for the Middle East, but for the whole world. From a general commercial perspective, about 12% of global trade finds its way through the Bab-el-Mandeb Strait. That's a value of about $1 trillion. Because of these attacks, there have been less than half as many ships crossing the sea in the first 2 weeks of January 2024, about 150, than there were last year at the same time, around 400, according to statistics from the New York Times. And as a result, the cost of shipping a standard container has risen significantly, depending on the measure you're taking. Now, from an energy perspective, on a normal day, about 7 million barrels of crude oil transit through the Red Sea. That number is considerably less now, since companies like Shell and BP have stopped transiting their oil through the Red Sea. On the other hand, oil prices and markets are not yet reflecting the increased risk of transiting the sea, and the price per barrel now is actually lower than what it was 3 months ago before the attacks. Nevertheless, Chevron CEO Michael Wirth at Davos last week, Chevron's American energy company, mentioned that the threat of an oil price spike is still real, especially if the disruptions continue for the next few months. Oil companies on the whole and energy markets seem to be more worried about tensions in the Middle East disrupting the flow of oil from the Strait of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf, from which a fifth of the world's crude oil supply originates. Any action in the future there as a result of geopolitical tensions, again, probably less likely, will have a more significant impact on oil prices because the oil supply itself flows out of that strait, the Strait of Hormuz, whereas problems in the Red Sea mean that oil transit needs to be rerouted. It takes longer. It will still, again, have an impact on oil prices, but not as much as if there are problems in the Strait of Hormuz, which are less likely.
Right. Now, James, I mean, I was wondering, do the Houthis have the same approach towards all ships, or do they take a more lenient stance towards Russian or Chinese flagged ships?
Right. So as you mentioned, the Houthis have announced that they will attack or interfere with the shipping of any country or any ship that is registered under a flag that is somehow connected to Israel in its war against Hamas following the October 7th attacks. How they determine this, how they determine levels of what they would see as complicity with the Israeli actions, is really anyone's guess. Will they determined that they'll attack ships registered under countries that recognize Israel? Will they spare shipping from countries that say support Hamas? It's not clear how they're drawing these distinctions. Now, they likely have help from an Iranian signals intelligence vessel, the Bashad, which has been sailing around the area. That's helping them identify and targeting vessels. Now, some ships they've attacked were not traveling to or from Israel and otherwise have no apparent connection to it. States like Malta, the Bahamas, Gabon, and the Marshall Islands. These are not countries that have made a big show, necessarily a big show of support of Israel. Additionally, the crew of the Galaxy Leader, which was a ship taken hostage by the Houthis, was mostly Filipino. So it's unclear how they're connected to the Israeli war effort at all. So they're not being particularly discriminating. Even the Houthis even fired on a Norwegian crude tanker earlier this month. And Norway, the government at least, has been critical of Israeli tactics in Gaza and even called for a reopening of peace negotiations. So I wouldn't say the Houthis are being particularly careful in their choice of targets. And it seems to depend on, which vessels happen to be crossing the Bab-el-Mandeb Strait at any one time. Now, the Houthis have announced that they will let Chinese and Russian ships through the strait. The Chinese and Russian governments both maintain close relations with Iran, which backs the Houthis, and both governments have either criticized Israel or failed to condemn the Hamas attacks against Israel. The Chinese government has called for attacks on shipping to stop in the strait, but it hasn't made any concrete moves to protect its own shipping or international shipping in general. And obviously, it hasn't joined the U.S.-led Operation Prosperity Guardian, which seeks to protect international shipping in the sea. Now, China may face more pressure if the crisis continues to raise shipping and energy costs. Beijing is no doubt concerned about its economic growth this year, which hasn't been, or last year, which hasn't been all that great. And of course, its economy depends chiefly on exports to the rest of the world and on a cheap and plentiful supply of energy, both of which are potentially threatened by Houthi action. So the longer the crisis goes on, China may put pressure on Iran to rein in the Houthis. Washington has tried to communicate to the Chinese that this would be a nice thing for them to do, but so far they haven't made any progress on that. And it probably depends on how long this crisis goes on and how it affects the Chinese economy.
Right. And
in the meantime, I think the Chinese are probably happy to let the U.S. take responsibility for the fallout of the crisis and potentially maybe humiliate itself, get further tied down in the region militarily, distract from Washington's focus on Taiwan and so on. So no doubt Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, is weighing political versus economic considerations here.
Mm-hmm. We know that the Saudis and Emiratis have been waging a nearly 5-year-long bombing campaign against the Houthis without really achieving any tangible results. So what exactly are United States and the United Kingdom aiming to achieve now with their air campaign against the Houthis?
Obviously, I can't speak on an official basis for the U.S. Or the British government, but the aim of Operation Prosperity Guardian was to protect international shipping from Houthi attacks. On January 11th, the United States, Great Britain, along with Canada, Australia, Bahrain, and the Netherlands, began to execute strikes against Houthi targets on the Yemen mainland. There have been about 9 rounds and counting of strikes, which are intended to degrade Houthi military capabilities over time, capabilities that threaten the sea lane. That means bombs were dropped on sites used for storing or launching missiles, drones, helicopters, etc., anything that would threaten shipping. Now, this is a fairly open-ended objective because the Houthis will likely keep receiving new arms shipments from Iran. And of course, they'll move around their launching sites to protect from bombings, try to stay one step ahead of the operation strikes. And of course, their intention is in holding the Strait hostage is connected with events in Israel and Gaza, which could last, for a whole other year. The Houthis, as you mentioned, are very tough fighters. They fought several wars with the previous government of Yemen and an 8-year war against the Saudi and Emirati-led coalition. The strikes of the last month have certainly bolstered their popularity in Yemen. There have been shows of support in Sana'a, and it's increased their prestige, the Houthis' prestige within the so-called axis of resistance of Iranian-aligned proxies. So what we have is the U.S. has a limited objective against an adversary with a high level of resolve, probably easy access to capabilities that allow them to keep holding the Strait hostage, and they have incentives that continue to point towards attacks. Now, President Biden last week did admit that the current strategy isn't stopping Houthi attacks, but he nonetheless pledged that the strikes would continue. And I think that shows that the White House is wary of escalating further, but obviously doesn't want to give the impression that it is abandoning U.S. responsibilities of protecting global commerce. So the hope is that even if the Houthis aren't deterred or compelled now, rather, they will gradually wind down their attacks. But that may be just a hope.
Right. James, it was so interesting speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Harun.
Jemenski Husi stali su na stranu Palestinaca od kako je Izrael pokrenuo vojnu ofanzivu na Gazu u oktobru prošle godine. Ali ko su Husi, ko ih podržava i zašto oni podržavaju Palestince? Idemo sada slikom do Londona gdje se nalazi dr. Burcu Ozcelik, stručnjakinja za Bliski Istok u konsultantskoj firmi Audere Group. Dr. Burcu, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera channel, and thank you so much for taking time to speak to us. Now, let me start by asking you, for a number of years, the main security issue in the al-Mandeba and the Red Sea was actually Somali piracy. So, and after a major coordinated naval operation which involved key international actors, it helped to address that threat, and it shows what concerted international effort can do in terms of providing maritime security. However, we are now seeing the same maritime shipping routes once again coming under threat, coming under the global spotlight, this time by the Houthis. Could you explain to our viewers what exactly are the Houthis trying to achieve by threatening ships passing through the al-Mandeba towards and onwards through the Red Sea?
Well, thank you, Harun, and thanks for having me on. What you're talking about there are the threats of the Somali piracy versus what we're seeing now unfold in the Red Sea through the al-Mandeba Strait, attacks carried out by the Houthi rebel group based in Yemen, in northern parts of Yemen. The Houthis are a military and political armed movement inspired by Islamic ideology. They adhere to various principles that were exported by Iran within the so-called axis of resistance. However, it's important to emphasize that the Houthis are a Yemeni-based domestic movement with aspirations to govern the country. They have been targeting vessels on a far lower level, a far smaller scale in the Red Sea for a number of years, and this goes back as far as a decade. The war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza and the tragedy that's unfolding there, of course, has given the Houthis the momentum, the arsenal of motivation and opportunity to now carry their conflict into the waters of the Red Sea to target international shipping. The Red Sea and the Strait are essentially one of the most important choke points for maritime trade and global commerce. Any disruption there threatens supply chains with knock-on effects on the price of commodities, consumer goods, and energy and oil and LNG. So this is significant. It differs from what we saw in the past, which peaked around 2011, 2012 with the case of Somali piracy, in that the Houthis are motivated by a politically inspired agenda, both desiring to put themselves on the international stage as a legitimate actor, and nationally in the Yemeni domestic politics and the dynamics there internally. One way to frame this from a perspective of the scholarship on the subject is the oft-cited idea of greed versus grievance. The kinds of motivations that drive armed actors, armed non-state actors, to take up this kind of action on the global stage. The case of Somali piracy was one of illicit organized activity in the same area or adjacent areas, but were motivated by poverty, economic underdevelopment, poor governance that was plaguing Somalia at the time. The Houthis, as I've tried to explain, are motivated by a very different set of ideas. They're far better armed militarily. They have significantly more firepower. This is owing to their close relationship with Iran. And they are empowered by a political agenda, which they see as resonating across the Middle East. And this stems, of course, from the ongoing war in Gaza.
But we know that, but how is it possible in the first place that the Houthis, who are a non-state actor, who have been bombed by the Saudi-led coalition for about 5 years, how is it that they still have the manpower, the motivation, and the firepower to pack such a punch and be able to disrupt global shipping lines?
The Houthis have proven very resilient, and this was expected from those who've been watching the conflict unfold over the years. Whilst we may be talking about the Houthis now because of the Red Sea military activity and the targeting by US and UK joint strikes, the Houthis have been an important player in the domestic dynamics in Yemen for a number of years. They originated as early as the late 1980s. and grew both in number and military capability thanks to their relationship with the Iranian regime. This said, it's important to note that the Houthis are not just a proxy of Iran within a very strict hierarchy of command and control. There is a level of agency within the Houthi movement that is important to acknowledge. This is not a typical patron-client type relationship. The Houthis are battle-hardened after a long and brutal fight with Saudi Arabia and the Saudi-led coalition within the internal dynamics and the civil war that has plagued Yemen, at great cost, of course, to its civilian population. Yemen is an extremely poor country on the brink of famine. And this has gone, many would say, unnoticed, or perhaps wasn't featured prominently enough in the foreign policy priorities of Western states in their approach to Yemen for the past decade. They have been empowered, emboldened by what's going on in Gaza, which has created, as you know, an overwhelming show of pro-Palestinian solidarity across many parts of the Middle East. And that, coupled with the military hardware, the ability that was granted by the close relationship with Iran, as well as training, has meant that the Houthis have now entered the world stage with a growing imprint as an armed non-state actor with political motivations.
Right. I mean, Dr. Burcu, when you said that, the Houthis are battle-hardened, I remember that back in 2009, at one point, they even crossed into Saudi territory and had skirmishes with the Saudi armed forces. So they've been in the region for quite a while, as you say. But I wanted to ask you, what exactly? I mean, you're based in the UK. We know that the UK and the US have been bombing Houthi targets over the last couple of days. Now, what exactly is their end goal? I mean, we know that these non-state actors cannot really be bombed into submission. So what exactly are London and Washington, D.C. trying to achieve?
The United States and the United Kingdom governments believed that they had no choice but to conduct these types of targeted, proportional, surgical strikes against Yemeni Houthi targets in Yemen, designed to downgrade their military capability and diminish their ability to target vessels and disrupt commercial maritime trade through the Red Sea, which is critical, of course, because of the high value goods that are traded there and the bridge that the Red Sea plays between the Middle East, Asia, and European markets, of course, which is essential. The Houthis have already demonstrated their resilience, and this has been witnessed since the beginning of the US-UK joint strikes. Whilst the UK and the US may have believed that they had no other choice, the Houthis are fighting back, and again, very much empowered by the ongoing events in Gaza, the uncertainty there that looms over the future of the Palestinians and the future of the territory of Gaza. What is happening, though, importantly, is that the US, UK, and allied states that have taken part or signed up to Operation Prosperity Guardian, which is essentially a maritime naval coalition to safeguard the Red Sea. The idea there is that it is possible to distinguish between what's going on in Gaza and what's going on in the Red Sea. So in a way, and this circles back to our original discussion about Somali piracy, what the US and the UK are trying to do is to argue that what's going on in the Red Sea is akin to the plague of Somali piracy and requires a strong military response. Many across the Middle East feel that this is inaccurate and are upset and responding on the proverbial sort of Arab street against this Western military response, in that there was no meaningful pro-peace type response when Yemen was suffering and on the brink of humanitarian catastrophe.
Right.
But now that the Red Sea is in danger of volatility, of supply chain disruptions, and the price of oil facing uncertainty again in the markets, now is when the US and UK strike. So there is an element of a concern that this betrays sort of a sense of callousness, I would say, on the part of foreign policymakers in the West, that the Yemeni people were not a priority, but now that the Red Sea is in danger, this is when they choose to act.
Right. Dr. Burcu, it was wonderful listening to you. Some really interesting points you made there. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to Al Jazeera.
Thank you so much.
Izraelska agresija protiv Palestinaca gura Bliski Istok u nove orbite smrti, razaranja i sve prisutnijeg straha od većeg haosa koji bi mogao uslijediti. Pružajući podršku izraelskim zločinima u Gazi, Zapad je uništio i posljednje ostatke kredibiliteta i doveo je takozvani na pravilima zasnovan svjetski poredak na tačku sa koje nema povratka. Poštovani gledalci, bilo je to sve u ovom izdanju emisije Granice Istoka. Ako ste propustili bilo koji dio, emisiju možete pregledati na našoj web stranici balkans.aljazeera.net. Hvala na pažnji.